I want to read to you 5 headlines, Noah. Friend of the program, you were referred to on the commentary pod yesterday. I think you've been dallying with other podcasts and broadcasters. Prime Minister Netanyahu vetoes further Cairo negotiations. Number 2, Israeli jets hit Lebanon in heaviest strike since Gaza war began. Number 3, IDF, credible evidence Hamas held hostages at Khan Yunis's Nasser hospital. Number 4 from the Wall Street Journal, Biden-Netanyahu relationship at boiling point as Rafah invasion looms. Number 5, UK Foreign Minister David Cameron, Israel must ensure aid reaches Gazans will breach international law if it doesn't. Number 6, Germany, France fear humanitarian catastrophe in Rafah. The Prime Minister vows to press ahead, and then that's Bibi. And then finally, U.S. Arab allies reportedly set to propose Palestinian statehood plan within weeks. That's a lot of headlines. How do you react, Noah Rothman?
The administration's schizophrenia has become impossible to ignore, and it's wholly counterproductive. Joe Biden comes out earlier in the week, Monday, I believe, alongside King Abdullah, and he reiterates what he said in a Thursday speech, that I'm looking for a ceasefire here, something temporary, but I'm going to extend it as long as I possibly can into something resembling a permanent ceasefire, which is something progressives in America have been advocating. That admission makes Israel's compliance with Joe Biden's desires very unlikely. He just undermines his own position there. And then he says something that's completely at odds. So he says, in Rafah, we expect Israel to take all efforts to protect civilian life, which is reasonable. At the same time, we have no desire for displacements. These two desires are in conflict. Israel's promoted this plan, pitched this plan to Egypt, according to the Wall Street Journal, that would create camps, refugee camps, with all appropriate humanitarian assistance in and around Rafah. But that would involve displacements. Now, which is it? Are we protecting civilian life, or are we avoiding the kind of aesthetics, I guess, the kind of environment that this administration doesn't like? This hostage raid in Rafah was extremely successful in 2 ways. 1, it freed 2 hostages on Super Bowl Sunday. And 2, it demonstrated that Rafah is not this community of innocent civilians who have just been forced into this situation by Israel's aggression. Hamas has penetrated every aspect, every element, every city and every town in Gaza. Its citizens are hostage to it and do its bidding, including housing prisoners. There is no place where Israel can't go because it's just out of bounds in this conflict. The whole of Gaza is involved in this conflict, civilians and Hamas terrorists alike. They're all intertwined. That's why Israel needs to complete its mission with all due alacrity, because on the other side of that is protection for Hamas, or protection for Gaza's citizens, not before.
I agree. Noah, question. Does the name Breckenridge Long ring a bell for you?
No, it does not.
He was the senior State Department official under FDR who repeatedly turned down requests for Jews to enter America during the Holocaust when they were fleeing Germany. It seems to me, in just the last week, our European allies and our American State Department Arabists have turned completely on Israel, put the burden on it. It's been 4 months since the massacre. They cannot leave Hamas and Sinwar in the tunnels in Rafah. They can't do that. It's like doing cancer surgery and leaving 1/10 of the cancer in there.
Yeah, and that seems intuitive to you and me, but I don't feel like the international community is willing to give up this myth that it's erected around Hamas as some sort of quasi-legitimate governing authority in Gaza. UN relief officials are on television on Sky News the other day. Martin Griffiths, who's
what a bozo!
He goes out there and he says, these guys are just not terrorists. They're a legitimate governing authority. Yeah, there's some bad apples, whatever. But generally, you have to talk about this like it is an elected government. And it's frankly sacrificed its legitimacy well before 10/7, but certainly after. You cannot say that if this is the legitimate sovereign of Gaza, then all of Gaza is engaged in this hostility. That is just a basic fundamental aspect of the laws of armed conflict going back since we've had laws of armed conflict. It's simply obnoxious, but it's also illustrative of how they have established these double standards, the international community and those who are beholden to them, like this current administration. which is very internationalist in its outlook, have erected this idea, this belief that Hamas deserves to have all the protections afforded to a legitimate governing authority. It does not. It does not abide by those protections. It hides behind them. It expects Israel to abide by them, and then it violates them with reckless abandon.
No, how do we explain the standard applied to Assad in the Syrian genocide and the standards applied to every other Arab government that is not a democracy, and that means all of them, and yet demand of Israel adherence to some set of rules that does not exist in international law? Why is that the default position of Democrats?
Well, that's parallel is actually really useful because, I mean, we allied in our memories how the Syrian civil war unfolded in the first 2, 3, 4 years. Assad got a lot of protection from his fellow Arabists in the region, from Arabists in the West. And it wasn't well until after Donald Trump took office that we began to take that conflict seriously and approach this genocidal campaign that he was waging like it was a genocidal campaign. Barack Obama did everything he possibly could to avoid the logical conclusions of his own rhetoric, up to and including begging the Russians to come in to provide some sort of a face-saving way out of his September 10th, 2013 speech, the most confused speech I maintain in the history of the presidency, in which he said, yeah, we got to go into this place, but Russia's going to rescue me from having to do anything about that. They went in, they said we got rid of all their chemical weapons stockpiles. They didn't. All they did was protect their warm water port at Tartus on the Mediterranean, and create the conditions in which we had a very dangerous and destabilizing several years in which Barack Obama eventually had to introduce troops into Western Syria because it had devolved into ISIS, with, by the way, the support of Assad. Assad was buying oil from ISIS. And then finally, when he got in there, we had NATO assets and Russian assets engaged in a hot conflict, shooting at each other's proxy targets in a very dangerous fashion for years. Indeed, that condition still persists a little bit today. It was that delusion, it was that effort to avoid containing that conflict that led to a much worse conflict. Those lessons have not been learned. Those lessons seem to be studiously avoided by especially this administration, but just about everybody else in the United States who is conflict averse. Nobly, justly conflict averse. This country doesn't like foreign entanglements, but our desire to avoid them makes them worse, especially in places like in the Levant, in the Middle East, in Israel, some of the most fought over territory in the world. We want to avoid our obligations there because it's just too hard to contemplate them. But in doing that, we end up creating worse conditions for us in the future.
You know, my theory is a little bit more simple, which is that they hate Bibi, and therefore they'll do whatever they can, because Bibi stands up to Americans. They don't care what we think. Last question for you, Noah. We've got a high alert on something that the Russians are either going to put into space or have put into space. Russia is having another Sputnik moment, and we're scared. Why aren't we passing the Ukraine aid yesterday, then? I mean, it doesn't make any sense to be worried about Russia and not to have passed the Ukraine. I'm a big proponent of blowing this through via discharge petition. I don't know if that's going to happen. But if that's a problem, if we're all going to get alarmed about a Russian space weapon, why are we not helping the Ukrainians?
Well, it beats me, Hugh. And Frank, and I was speaking with the leader yesterday, Leader McConnell, and some other lawmakers, and asking, hey, do we have a plan B to restore depleted American ordnance stocks, which is what the supplemental is all about? It is depleting the stocks that we've taken from places like South Korea and Israel in order to support this war before 10/7, and in America. And their answer is no. There is no plan B to restore our depleted ordnance stocks. It's just going to persist as a big red flag for us and a tempting target for our adversaries abroad. So no, I can't understand why that is. And frankly, if Mike Turner released this information just to light a fire under his own conference, God bless him. Good for him. The insurgents in this conference, how dare you, sir? They rend garments and hold their pearls and say, how dare you? The decorum of this institution doesn't abide by it. Well, it's too bad. You guys can do whatever you want.
Not when you've got the far left and the far right that are nutters. Not when you've got Matt Gaetz and AOC. By all means, light fires all over the place.